And we're live. Welcome. Welcome, guys. Welcome to Let's Talk Markets live on this December 3rd. Welcome back, everyone, from Thanksgiving holiday. I hope you all ate too much. I know I did. In fact, I had 5 Thanksgiving dinners. I was pretty proud of that.
At the same place?
No. It was 5 across 3 places. So really, I think an accomplishment. I think I set a new standard for myself this Thanksgiving.
Did you have some of each turkey? That's the real question.
I did. Yeah.
Okay.
I actually, I'm going to be controversial for a minute. I advocated for no turkey, a turkey-free Thanksgiving, because
this is JD Vance heretical view that turkey's the worst part of Thanksgiving.
It's not good. Even the best turkey, and I used to make the best turkey. I would smoke a turkey. It would all be gone.
Are plainly doing something wrong over there in the Lauer establishment.
I'm sorry, you can't make even the best turkey. It's just pales in comparison to what I believe should be the centerpiece of a Thanksgiving, which is a prime rib. That's all.
Prime rib is pretty good. I here's my version of the heresy, which is that I think I do like a Thanksgiving turkey, but I think what's better is a Christmas ham.
Christmas ham. These things are all superior. What about a different bird?
No. You guys are doing it wrong. Whatever you're doing it wrong. You are all invited to my place for Thanksgiving. We had 28 people this year. All 2 turkeys, count them, 2 turkeys. We got through
my mom
1.5
would be
pretty
very
efficiently.
Happy about that. We had 24 people. She bought 2 turkeys, and I refused to let her make the second one.
I mean,
okay. Well, then I think your mom should come to my place for Thanksgiving from now on, Dave, because we're doing it right down in Florida. But look, clearly the best part of the Thanksgiving dinner is the pies for dessert. So I don't even know what you're talking about with your hams and your prime ribs and blah, blah, blah. If you got pumpkin pie, apple pie, and lemon meringue pie, you have clearly done Thanksgiving correctly.
I can get behind that.
Pies are where the last American regional differences exist. Because to me, the holy trinity are pumpkin, apple, and pecan. But I'm Southern.
So I totally love pecan, and my mom makes this absolutely amazing chocolate pecan pie, which if you've never had chocolate pecan pie, go out and have some. So I can totally get behind that as well, Justin. It just so happens that lemon meringue is my all-time favorite. And so I have to throw that in there.
I can't argue with either of those things. I would take the 4 pie solution in this situation. But not to throw kerosene on the fire here, but I don't like stuffing either. I think stuffing is an inferior food.
Oh my God!
There's one stuffing.
This is an argument about capitalism, and there's so much in this country. There's so many options, and we let everyone be wrong together in their own stuff. We don't push one meal on them. We let them all make their own choices, good or mostly bad.
But maybe, Justin, you would like the stuffing the only stuffing I like is a cornbread sausage stuffing.
That sounds pretty good.
That sounds awesome.
It is delicious. I make it every year. And other than that, forget about it. Toss the rest out.
Okay. You've redeemed yourself with your cornbread sausage stuffing, Lauer.
All right. Back to crypto. So,
which was the conversation at most Thanksgiving meals, I suspect, this year, as usual.
I bet there was quite a bit. We went into Thanksgiving and we just said, we're not going to do politics. We actually, my wife and I were looking at the list of things that maybe we shouldn't talk about. And all we were kind of left with was sports. And when the Eagles are sucking so bad, that's even in itself a depressing topic. But no, I had very little crypto. Actually, no one seemed interested in politics this year, which is good. And so, but maybe everyone's experience was different. Tokens right now are tanking despite this quite supportive environment. Even Bitcoin is sort of taking it on the chin, but I don't know, last I saw around 92,000 holding up reasonably well. And so, to introduce you guys to try and figure all this out, we invited our old friends, Lee Schneider, who works at Ava Labs. I never know. Is it Ava?
Yes, it's Ava or Ava, as you prefer.
Okay. Either way. And Justin Slaughter, VP of Regulatory Affairs at Paradigm. two absolute experts on crypto from a regulatory, legal, and market structure perspective. So because of that, let's talk price and trades.
Which is something we are both totally equipped to answer. So I've obviously got you firstly.
No, I was going to say I do know that 92,000 is higher than 80,000, so that obviously means something.
Means something. That's right.
I mean, so obviously, I'm going to start by saying, as per usual custom, to be clear, any partisan views I might express here today are mine and not an official position of the firm. We at Paradigm have both experienced Republicans and Democrats on our team. We focus on what's best for crypto, not what is best for one party or another. I'm a big Democrat. I will now say, yeah, I wish I knew which way the price of any tokens was going to go. This came up for me in Thanksgiving, where one of my friends said, "So, price of Bitcoin's tanking." I'm like, yeah, it's down like 20%, but like that is just a day ending in Y in crypto. This is a space where there's a lot of volatility, and there has been for a long time. I mean, since we've agreed to record this, it's gone back up. Bitcoin has by 7,000. But I think it's actually important to note, in policy, I find that the interest policymakers have in crypto does seem to move or be influenced dramatically by the price level of major tokens, which is kind of surprising. And I was debating this with my spouse this morning, because she was saying, is it the volatility of the price? I'm like, well, it's both. And that for a lot of people, they only notice it when it's in the headlines, which usually occurs off of a big price run up or a big price crash. And then it becomes in the context of how it has dramatically increased or dramatically decreased, which is kind of surprising because the inherent technology usage is there, whether or not the price is up 10% in a day or down 10%. But the volatility does something to our, charismatic great ape minds that seems to, make it harder for us to grok how that works.
I agree with everything that you just said, Justin. The only thing I would add is, when we think about network security, one of the bases for network security is often around the price of a token. And so the price of the token, again, these are just the protocol layer tokens. The price of the token is sort of a factor that people probably should be considering when they think about network security. But I mean, look, as you said, Justin, if I knew how to trade, maybe I'd be in a different line of work, but I don't know how to trade. I'm a buy and hold guy, which means I don't take on leverage, which has worked out pretty well for me overall. But, holding gets awful rough when you see a 20, 30, 40, 50% decline in the value of your portfolio because, it's a day ending in Y. I also note that the word volatility ends in Y. So maybe volatility is just another day in crypto.
Well, I mean, that's what's interesting, right? Is that crypto is a roller coaster in terms of you can have more price swings. But despite that, the system holds up well with those price swings. In 2008, famously, yes, right, worst year ever stock market, or the S&P, I looked at it last night, it's like 38% off in a year. And that required bailouts from DC to New York lit on I-95 like Roman torches. And we, dropped 30%. And it's like, oh, wow, that sure was a day.
Yeah. I think this is a point that not enough people make, Justin, which is that the crypto markets, particularly the DeFi markets, are very resilient to these price drops. I think those markets hold up very, very well with huge price volatility. People get bought in and sold out, and their positions go all over the place. And for whatever reason, you don't hear the people who got bought in and sold out jumping up and down screaming for bailouts. So I think that's by and large a good thing. And I think there's been some academic research on this too that has shown that the DeFi markets have held up particularly well in times of stress.
There is, and that we looked back, I've seen people do this as well, and both contemporaneously and since the major events of stress during early DeFi summer 2020 during COVID, in the 22 experience, especially around the FTX bankruptcy, during SVB, and DeFi was up. There were no significant issues. It was operating. It was liquid. I mean, this is the great and terrible thing about crypto is everything's transparent. There's nowhere to hide. The most financial crises happen because of an arbitrage of information where people don't know or the market doesn't, where there is a risk, and then there is a sudden realization of that fact, and then there is the dramatic change in expectations leading to people suddenly being insolvent. Here, everything's on chain, so you can get sucked out, but the system keeps working.
Yeah.
Well,
That's a great
and
point.
it's merciless, right? It
Yeah.
sells you
It's in
out or
code,
buys
right?
you in.
Yeah.
There's nobody. Yeah, there's nobody you can call to say, oh, please give me another 24 hours. I'll come in with more collateral, right? And we saw that with how is it pronounced? Archegos.
I was going to talk about Archegos. Absolutely, it's the perfect example, right?
It's a perfect example.
Risk.
It was the second notable crisis I helped the SEC chair with when I was in the acting chair's office in 21 after GameStop. Is all these little events were in the tenure of acting chair Allison Heron Lee, even though it was a short tenure, only 3 to 4 months. We had our share of mandating emergency response in the markets in 25.
Yep. And that was a situation where the prime brokers effectively knew about the problem, right? And some of them even knew the gravity of the problem. One or two of them took appropriate action, and the rest of them just sort of sat there and lost, hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's tough to live in a merciless world, but sometimes living in a merciless world preserves the integrity of that world.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, even in the Archegos example, right? While they found out about the issue only came about because of a lack of transparency, right? Because there was no visibility into the fact that Archegos had essentially pledged their same collateral multiple times over. And so there's something to be said for everything being on chain and that not being possible.
That's the idea, that when things are truly on chain and you want things that are truly in crypto and not in, crypto and name only, where you have a bunch of, not on chain accounts, reapplication's visible then. People say, hey, this account's been promised on multiple things. That won't work as the code, or everyone can see it and then immediately take response. And it works for the regulators too. If the SEC had known that Archegos had that level of reapplication, something could have happened before they got margin called.
Well, and part of the crazy thing is that, not to talk about he who shall not be named, but SBF was going around to the CFTC saying, we've got systems in place that are merciless when it comes to buying in and selling out. And that was just not true. And they were, taking assets from clients and other things.
Like 90% true. The problem was
where
it wasn't
was
true
the affiliate part. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, we'll just let our affiliates steal your assets. But no, but seriously, like we see that stark differentiator there, and it reminds us all that the true DeFi, the true crypto stuff works pretty well, or at least so far the empirical evidence is that it works pretty well.
Okay, so prices aside, ups and downs, does this, you guys have been through a few of these now, I've been through a few of these, I'm curious, does this feel like a normal cycle to you from a crypto perspective? Like there have been several 60 to 80% drawdowns in crypto over the years. And, needless to say, were I a better trader, I would not have sold in the midst of those and would be, sitting on an island somewhere. But I'm not, I'm up in Canada where it's very snowy right now. But, to me, this so far, it just feels like we're in the midst of sort of a standard crypto cycle. What do you guys think?
So it's interesting, right? Because there's this thesis of the 4-year cycle, which would line up perfectly with, a crash in December of this year, because there were crashes in late 17. There was a crash in early 14, which is almost the 4-year cycle. And there was a crash that began basically in December 21. I don't know is the basic answer, in part because this is, in the last 4 years, a weird set of circumstances. It was the first real time that crypto was a mass market in many ways. You didn't have that in the prior cycles. Now you have a lot more involvement. it is also the case that usually that occurs after a blow off top. If you look at market analysis, we haven't really had that in the same way. I think Ether is still roughly at the same high level of the last cycle. And on top of that, you have all these structural factors of, like, first off, as you note, regulatory positions changing, the Fed rate fund. It's one of those things where I view it kind of like the way they call recessions, is you can only call when a cycle has ended about a year later based off of data that's not fully available at the time. So I'm kind of agnostic on it. In truth, right? The degree to which the cycles happen, and I think is sometimes something we focus on too much, because it focuses then on the pure price of the tokens and not on the utility of the technology. But I'm curious what Lee thinks about this.
I'm going to me too most of what you said, Justin, because I think those
It
are.
doesn't involve me getting canceled.
I mean, I think those are all good observations. I'd just add two things. One is, it's been interesting to see that the crypto markets are down while the equities markets are pretty resilient and maybe are even going to make, new all-time highs, as I've seen some people predict. And it's not clear to me what the reason for that is, why there's a somewhat of a disconnect between those two marketplaces. The second observation I would make is, I do think that as an asset class, crypto has limited empirical data to look at. When people do analyses of the equities markets, they go back to 1929 or before, and they do these careful analyses and look for different trends over different lengths of cycles and all kinds of stuff like that, most of which I barely understand when I read them. But we don't have that long history for crypto markets. And I think even overall, if you look at the overall trend line, we're pretty up from where everybody was at the start of whenever you pick the start, right? If Bitcoin's the start, Bitcoin's pretty far up since the start. If you pick Ether, if you pick AVAX, if you pick Sol, if you pick Uni, Aave, right? Everything's up. So it's just that we happen to be down from highs right now. And so, is that a big deal? Yeah, it's probably important in the grand scheme of things, but not as important as, what it's going to look like a year from now. Because if we are still here where we are now, a year from now, that's going to make everybody feel a lot worse, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you talk about how this cycle could be, let's say, fundamentally different from past cycles, you have a totally different level of institutional ownership and involvement, a totally different regulatory environment, and much more.
Can I argue with you about a totally different regulatory environment for just a minute, Dave?
Go ahead. Absolutely.
Because look, and this is not to say anything about the current SEC, which I think the Crypto Task Force has done a great job of learning and gathering information. I read every word of Chairman Atkins' speeches because I'm looking to see what the direction of travel overall is going to be. But the only thing that's a little bit more certain about regulation right now than it was, 18 months ago, was that we're not going to get sued tomorrow, right? And, a lot of projects didn't get sued, even at the height of the Gensler witch hunts, if I may be a little bit provocative there, depending on which side you're sitting. But right, so I think you could say sort of the overall environment is better, but the level of clarity is not better. And everybody keeps saying that they want clarity, me included. I keep reminding everybody, including myself, that with clarity comes a lot more responsibility, and there's going to be a lot of, pardon my language, shit to do once we get clarity, especially if the Clarity Act or the draft RFIA prevail, where we're going to have a lot of clear rules, except there's still going to be investment contract, and everybody's going to go, do I have an investment contract or not? Because if I don't have an investment contract, I don't got to do all of that stuff. And, lawyers like me are going to structure everything so that it's not an investment contract, because then you're just in this secondary markets trading land, and it's a lot simpler than all of these complicated disclosure requirements and whatnot that are going on. So like I don't think the regulatory environment is that much different, other than the fact that there's a much lower chance that you're going to get sued if you're not committing fraud.
So I think this is an important point, right? Which is that Lee's right, that there have not been a lot of concrete regulatory releases yet, which is typical for the first year of a term. The difference is the signaling that they're coming in some capacity. Part of the problem, I'll say this, that the SEC and the CFC are facing right now is there is one thing that they can't do. I was watching as former CFC chair Tim Massad gave a speech in November where he said, we don't need legislation, we just need regulation with the agencies. And I was thinking to myself, having worked at both agencies, good luck. Those two, like, it's really hard for them to work together in general on easy stuff, let alone hard stuff like this. But even if you got them together and put them in a room and brainwash them where they would easily agree with each other, whatever the agreement is, they can't alone solve one really hard thing, which is that where does the line between security and commodity or third things fall? Even when the regulators try and make that clear, that is not something that becomes automatically the law. You could have private suits. You could have, rescissionist suits by the states as well. The only way you can resolve that is with legislation. And until you get legislation that says that fundamental fact, which is the major part of clarity in RIFA, there's not that much that can really be dealt with by the agencies. My sense also is the agencies are afraid of overstepping what Congress is trying to do and kind of involving themselves in this way. So we've moved from a very active mindset in terms of taking the lead on, approach from the Biden administration to one where Congress takes the view and the Trump administration is the lead. But that seems to be why they haven't moved so far. My understanding is if they don't pass market structure in the next 6 months, that they're going to try to do regulations then, and they may be less adept at providing clarity than legislation. But that seems to have been the major holdup so far.
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree with you, Justin. I think that is the lay of the land right now, between Congress and the regulators. I will say that I think people are spending way too much time on this, is it a security or not question? And when I say people, I mean literally everyone. I think Congress is spending too much time on it. I think the SEC and the CFTC are spending too much time on it. I think we've spent way too much time on it. And to your point about a third thing, right? That is the way forward, in my view. And we've put a bunch of proposals before Congress, before the SEC and the CFTC, in comment letters and otherwise, explaining how we think it all should get whacked up, and trying to do it in as simple and straightforward a way as possible, because all of this hand wringing about is it a security or is it a commodity is probably in large part irrelevant, because at the end of the day, it's just another type of asset that trades electronically and is custodied electronically. And so from our perspective, the best solution is to give both the SEC and the CFTC jurisdiction over the intermediaries that are doing all of this trading, and let the market sort all of that stuff out. And I realize that is not uncontroversial a view, and I realize that there is some toing and froing between different committees in Congress and regulatory and regulators and everything like that. But I think we are opting for complexity over simplicity. And it's not making a heck of a lot of sense to me, because the complexity we are opting for is so complicated that I'm going to be gainfully employed as a lawyer well into my 90s trying to sort all of this nonsense out for clients.
This is
Well,
exactly.
one thing.
Thought on that.
Yeah, and I just to, it feels like, okay, so we started talking about, has the regulatory environment changed much? I would probably argue the reduced threat of being sued is a pretty fundamental shift. Like the chilling effect that had was significant, but that aside,
that really chilled the meme coin craze. Yep,
well,
there was
right,
there was a cold wind blowing through the meme coin craze there.
No, but I would say it probably it made it so things like that became much more common, and you know, and it drove more activity into non-utile stuff, because the actual, you know, builders, especially in the US at least, were nervous and threatened to get into things, and now that is gone, I think that's a fundamental difference. But point taken.
I think that's right. And we talked to portfolio companies who really feel like now they can build, and if they make a mistake, it's not an automatic death sentence.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of,
seems like a big deal.
That's part of what the disconnect is, I think, where there was a mindset, I think, in the last admin where you've got to be perfect. If you can't be perfect, we don't want you. It's like, well, no one's ever going to do anything. And the answer is, well, that's fine. But then you're basically saying we don't want this at that point. And they were never willing to admit to that in public, I feel like. On the complexity point, this to me is what the final goal of legislation is going to be. I care much less about a test that if I put enough money into it, I can figure anything out after $30 million, because it's only useful to then people that already have tons of money, not to startups. The goal should be to make it as clear as possible for the vast majority of tokens.
Yes.
My problem with your theory of the joint oversight is, having worked, again, read the story third time now, at both agencies, anything that overlaps gets complicated. There's no way for them to share so that it doesn't become very complicated, in part because they have different rule books, they have different mindsets. So I view this like a football field. Right now we have the entire field is covered in fog. Our goal is to get the fog out of that field as much as possible and reduce it to just within, hopefully, 5 yards. And there'll still be some disclarity then at the margins, but everyone else in the rest of the field can play, can, build. And in that way, we get real forward momentum and then slowly shrink that additional disclarity over time.
So I want to jump in with the next thought, which is, and this is something, Lee, you and I have talked about from like the very beginning when we started talking about these issues, which is this idea of taxonomy, right? And then Atkins comes out just a couple of weeks ago, and he says, right, he wants this taxonomy. Is that the answer to this question of what is what and what goes where?
I mean, inside the SEC, the problem is agencies can't make taxonomies for other agencies. Mm-hmm. Even the president can't, because we have a system in this country of 8,000 independent agencies, which is good. Mostly, I like it. It's decentralized. It avoids having these giant megalith organizations like MAS in Singapore, which is everything. But as a result, only Congress can provide the taxonomy. You can do your absolute best to say, here's where I think my jurisdiction is. Under the new system we have in judicial review for administrative agencies, under Corner Post changing the Chevron doctrine, courts can say we reject that. The only real way to get a true taxonomy is lasting as legislation. That's the problem, is the hardest route. And also, Congress is not good at this, because over the last 30 to 40 years, it's atrophied its ability to actually define what is what at the congressional level. We defer so much to the agencies. Even in Dodd-Frank, right, we did that. And that's kind of what animates me, is there were certain parts of swaps in Dodd-Frank after the financial crisis, which were given as joint jurisdiction. It was basically kind of narrow swaps on certain projects between CFTC and SEC, things like security-based swaps. And those became a dead field because no one could make it work within the two competing jurisdictions. If we replicate that with crypto, I think you'll have the same impact there as well.
Yep. So I'm going to agree with you guys somewhat and disagree with you guys somewhat. First of all, saying that meme coins were not utility and a distraction, I think misses the fact that they drove a huge amount of on-chain activity, and that really tested a variety of the blockchains. It brought money to a variety of the blockchains. And saying that, well, people decided not to build serious stuff, they just built funny stuff, if that's the argument, I like, sure, I guess, but not really, right? Like whatever people are building is contributing to these ecosystems, even if it's for a short period of time. And so I wouldn't just wave away the meme coin stuff quite so readily. I personally don't think that Solana would be in the position that they're in right now if it hadn't been for all of the meme coins on Solana. And they did a great job seeding that the meme coin stuff. They did a great job processing it by and large, right? So kudos to them for really seeing the trend and understanding that that was important. The other point that I would make is, a lot of people talked about projects moving offshore, and I think we saw a lot of that. And as far as I can tell, a lot of people took the time period to really try to build more serious, in-depth, thoughtful projects, as opposed to just throwing something together. If they weren't doing meme coin, right? I'm talking about layer 1, layer 2 stuff, and other types of protocols, DeFi protocols, right? They spent more time building those things because of the quote unquote fear of getting sued or whatever. And so I do think we're seeing the benefits of that overall. The other thing that I would say is, Justin, I know that the shall we say elbows between the SEC and the CFTC have not always been super comfortable, and I take your point about the atrophy in security-based swaps and whatnot, but I'm not saying, and our proposals don't say, that both agencies get full jurisdiction over everything, right? There is an argument to be made that sometimes token sales are investment contracts and securities, and that stuff should still be within the SEC's purview. But there's also a really good argument to say that we want qualified intermediaries to be intermediating in these markets. And the nice thing about the US is we have two sets of qualified intermediaries. Sure, they have different asset types that they focus on, although arguably options are a form of derivative, so not that different from what the CFTC focuses on. And to me, the idea that we should not leverage the existing regulatory infrastructure, the existing intermediaries who know how to trade and settle stuff electronically, and instead create an entirely new regulatory system that is special purposed for however we're going to define digital commodity, that just seems like such a colossal investment of time and money and resources that can be much better used elsewhere. And just one last thing, and I'll let you jump in, Justin, which is your point about, if I got to spend $30 million to get it right, then I'm going to keep a lot of people out of the market. Well, that's exactly what's going to happen if we have to create a whole new regulatory scheme, and it's going to be slow.
Yeah, it's interesting.
But okay, doesn't this just lay bare the absurdity of our financial regulatory system in the US and the obvious need to merge the SEC and CFTC and have them have oversight of anything that is electronically custodied and traded?
Well, if it's a financial instrument, you mean, right? Because lots of things get electronically custodied and traded.
Fair. I mean, the financial assets that are electronically traded and custodied.
I'm a wet on this in that I actually think you could merge the two, but it only works in the structure of a broader reorganization of the whole system. It cannot be just these two agencies being meshed together, because I'll tell you what's going to happen in that case. The CFTC's various bailiwicks would just get subsumed. the SEC is too big, its culture is too strong. You would just have these things, I fear, become overlooked, and everything would become SECized. And the SEC is not a perfect place. No agency is, but it's got its own manias and blind spots. So if you're going to do a full reorg of the entire system, take moving pieces around, I think that could be good. We go from 9 or 10 to like 3 to 4. Beyond that, I think the reason I think we actually need a new structure on this for this fit for purpose for crypto largely is I see this as the direction of travel. I think we're going to see everything basically move toward tokenization. I do think things will stay at the SEC. We've been saying for a while now, me included, that if you're a share of Apple stock tokenized, that's still security. That's nothing new. It's things which have different orthogonal elements that require the new system. And I think over time, those orthogonal elements are going to beat the existing system.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a valid role for the CFTC and the SEC separate and apart from each other, and I'm not disputing that, and I am not suggesting that all financial instruments should be equally regulated by the two. What I am saying is that protocol tokens, well, I'll use the term that I like, which is protocol tokens, the tokens that are integral to the functioning of a protocol, whether that's a DeFi protocol or a layer 1 or a layer 2, or God forbid, not a blockchain related protocol that somebody invents a token for, right? This is a little bit of a new area. And to go back to Justin's point about a third thing, right? Which, by the way, the UK Law Commission recognized a number of years ago that there is a third type of thing out there, slightly different context, but it was related to digital assets and protocol tokens.
But other countries are more easily able to recognize that there's a new type of thing because they don't have competing.
I completely disagree with that.
Okay.
I completely disagree with that. Like every country has its quirks, right? Like going around and trying to do the comparative thing is very difficult. But my point is that
we all live there.
Yeah, exactly. What's that country that's an island in the middle of the Rhone River or something like that? Liberland or whatever.
There's also
Rhine River. I don't know. We could all move there.
It switches jurisdiction each day, basically, or every 6 months between France and Spain. There's all these weird things in the market.
Right. So I do think that there are, elements of protocol tokens that look like securities, and there are elements of protocol tokens that look like commodities, and it's okay for us, I hate this quote when it comes in movies and stuff like that, but people say, two things can be true at the same time. Well, no shit. Of course, two things can be true at the same time. But this is one of those situations where, we should acknowledge the fact that there is overlap in both, and that we've got a type of asset that doesn't easily fall into either category. And it's okay for us to say that and say that it's going to be regulated as follows. And I think Congress should do that. I don't want to keep arguing about whether or not there's an investment contract. It is not a fruitful inquiry as to whether or not there's an investment contract. It is an inquiry that can be second guessed to infinity, or at least until the end of the statute of limitations. And it's not helpful. So what would be really helpful in my view is Congress says, here's a new type of asset, and here we go. And by the way, if Congress decides all SEC, great. If Congress decides all CFTC, great. If Congress decides both agencies, great. But just let's make a decision and let's go. LFG.
Yeah, I mean, anyone waiting for Congress to make a perfect decision as well is probably like waiting for Godot. But at the same time, I'm kind of in that with you too, where I'm like, whatever the outcome is, whatever the taxonomy is, we can live with it. We all will. I mean, it might not be optimal in the way that it might be optimal for me to be 3 inches higher and be a pro basketball player, but everyone can live with it once it's actually locked in as a product of a multi-stakeholder negotiation. I think this is something that really has been eating at me, which is, I think for 5 years now, the struggle in the US has been because of benign neglect by the first few admins, because of technological growth, there was no way to resolve the hard questions of crypto except through legislation. And a lot of people across the board, I hold a few parts of the last administration, especially liable for this, but it was a lot of people were in denial that there was any way forward that wasn't that. We needed to cut through the Gordian knot, which can only happen through legislation. And I think that's the good news, is now we're there, years too late. I was talking to a member of Congress. I don't often do this, but I did this rare case. And I felt for him, because he was like, part of the problem we're struggling with is we're having to learn about this year, and we've not done any work. And I'm like, I'm sympathetic. You didn't get the right signals in the last few years. You needed to learn about it. And it's hard to learn about this topic in general. And for him, he was really struggling with DeFi. But that's what has happened. We wasted, September and October not working our term paper. And now it's Thanksgiving, and we got to do the whole, research and writing in 3 weeks. That sucks. The way out of it is to, really not complain, but figure out how to get more time on the books.
Okay, so let's go down this rat hole here of congressional action.
Can we go down a rabbit hole instead of a rat hole? Just
I'm a programmer. We call them rat holes, but it's much fuzzier if you go down a rabbit hole. But let's talk about the
you understand that rabbit hole is a reference to Alice in Wonderland, where Wonderland is at the other end of the rabbit hole.
Yes,
that's why I want to go down
that's
there.
Why. Okay, so let's
not a pleasant place either. In the book.
So Lee wants to get to Wonderland, and he doesn't want to be in some rat's nest, which is when you're a programmer, you end up in the rat's nest, right? But let's hope. Well, maybe, I don't know. Wonderland's it's pretty. If we can get some LSD in the congressional water supply, are you saying maybe we will have a better outcome for crypto clarity? And
all I'm saying is more people should read Lewis Carroll. How's that?
But can Congress answer any hard questions anymore? I mean, this
is why they're struggling.
It's tough to imagine.
It's really hard, and
yeah,
something that has happened in FINREG since Dodd-Frank in many ways, and that itself was a change versus the previous 10 years, where you had these bursts of bills. They weren't all good bills, Greenwich Wiley and the terrible swap deregulation. But to build actual regulatory regimes is hard, involves hard questions. And I think one thing that has bedeviled a lot of policy issues is Washington these days is a small C conservative town, and that most people are afraid of making this and getting judged for it. Better to be able to push the buck to somebody else and say, that wasn't me, that was someone else. But that's part of why you need to be able to have something where everybody jumps, figures out a solution and then is okay with that outcome. Because you can't actually, as a member of Congress, just avoid responsibility for all choices forever, as much as you might be frightened by making the wrong choice. Sooner or later, the decision has to be made.
So,
I agree with all of that. Look, I do think Congress is capable of making a decision here, and I look, I've been running around Capitol Hill for the last 6, 7, 8 years talking about blockchain and crypto and token classification, which I think is important. And the level of knowledge that has developed has really been good. And there are some really knowledgeable, smart people who are thinking about these issues. That's why I don't understand why we're opting for so much complexity when we could be opting for more simplicity. But I do also understand that there's a legislative process at play. And that legislative process means that lots of people are going to have lots of different opinions, and things are going to get into bills that Lee Schneider doesn't agree with. And maybe Justin and Dave also don't agree with it, but other people see that there's a good way to make a political compromise and make something happen. And so to Justin's point, look, we will be overall happy with whatever clarity comes out of Congress. And obviously we're grateful for all of the hard work that those people are doing. That doesn't mean that we don't think there might be other approaches that would be simpler and more straightforward and get us to robust market structure quicker.
Well, so you guys are very tapped into these efforts. So what's going on? Like what is happening in Congress today to attempt to provide this clarity? What kind of timeline do you think we're on? Which is a crazy question with Congress, I understand. But I'm going to put it to you anyway.
I mean, Congress, the good news is we're on a fast timeline in that they've moved through most of the process of doing a big bill in 1 year. But here's the story, right? So you had this bill clarity, which was a similar bill to the old bill from 2023, which then passed the FIT 21 Act.
The FIT 21, right? Yeah.
They updated a lot of it. They had this system of jurisdictions shifting back and forth, and FIT, they got moved to one around decentralization. That passed through the House earlier this year. I want to say it was in May or June. Passed alongside the Genius Act, which passed the law, different system. Now it's in the Senate. They released a draft discussion bill the Republicans did in the summer. The issue, of course, in the Senate is that anything that involves regulatory changes has to have 60 votes. That's required because of the filibuster. There are 51 Republicans in the Senate. You need at least 9 Democrats. Therefore, if you want to move anything, it's when you get all Republicans. So now, over the last basically 3 months, there's been this series of negotiations, mostly in private, between the Republicans and the Democrats on what the bill should look like. Ironically, right, on a lot of the bill, they are mostly in alignment. The easy part of the bill, which mostly everyone agrees with, is there needs to be something at CFTC for parts of crypto that everyone understands are commodities, things like Bitcoin, things are Ether, etc. The hard part are 3 things. One, where the dividing line between jurisdiction is. And there's some thought of using the clarity test. There's some thought of using something else in terms of what's called the ancillary asset test, or some third version. We can go into detail on that. There's the hard question, second, of what to do about DeFi. And then the third question is what to do about ethics of political officials involved in crypto. Allegedly, there's supposed to be a release of an updated bill that combines the Democratic views and the Republican views of both the agriculture committees and the banking committees sometime this month, that then would lead to a markup. That's been hoped for a few weeks now. Shut down. That will either get marked up then, meaning they go through kind of line by line of the committee and say, make all their little edits and make amendments. The bills are then reconciled, it goes to the Senate floor. And then once it passes, you then either have a conference committee between the two bodies, the House and Senate, and they both pass the final version, or the House just takes the bill. The problem we have is, maybe you noticed, December, we were talking about Thanksgiving earlier, there's only 3 weeks of work left this year. Mm-hmm. You also then have next year an election year. And on top of that, government funding is to run out again in late January. So the ideal timeline, which is a bit like, watching Indiana Jones go through all these different traps, is you have a markup late this month in the Senate committees. You have passage in the Senate in January, and then passage in the full Congress sometime next year. Most likely what we're looking at, I think right now, is a markup in January, passage to the Senate, if we're lucky, in January, or maybe a little bit later, and then passage later next year. A lot still has to go right. So many bills make it from the House to die in the Senate. The great line is the House proposes, the Senate disposes. Whether we can get over the line on this is anybody's guess. I think we now have, for the first time, a broad sense within Congress, from even the super pro-crypto side, like Senator Gillibrand and like Senator Scott, to people who are much more skeptical, like Senator Warren, that something needs to happen. Senator Warren released her own principles for the first time earlier this summer. The hard part is getting to a consensus on what, and then in that short timeline. A lot of people have said that you have to do it in an odd-numbered year, and that's not quite correct. The last great bill on tech policy was Telecom Act 96, which passed in a presidential election year, in fact, in the even-numbered year. Dodd-Frank itself passed ultimately in July of 2010, so 18 months into Congress. But it is true that there's the basically irrepressible ticking of the clock on us now to make progress on this and get it through the Senate before we get too far into election season.
So what do you think? I mean, I'd be interested in some of the details of where this bill might land on some of these issues. But I mean, like, what are, I don't know if this is an impossible question. It's an interesting timeline you just gave, but like, what are the odds, right? Like, what are the odds that nothing happens? Let's start with that. Maybe that's an easier thing easier question to answer.
The odds that legislation doesn't pass this Congress, I should say, I'm at about 50-50 right now.
Okay.
I am.
So am I. I think that's exactly right.
More optimistic than I was. I thought, or rather I feared, that there would be passage through the House. It would be super partisan. And then there would be no momentum to get a deal in the Senate that everybody can agree with. And the bill would just sit around and die. We avoided that fate. There were a lot of Dems. It was 77 that voted for the Clarity bill, which is, and even though you lost some people who voted for FIT, you gained so many more members. That was positive. We had this big group of senators on the D side who voted for Genius and said, we want something. It's time to pass something. Again, I'm happy that even the people like Senator Warren's office say they want something. So that we've gone through those checkpoints.
Mm-hmm.
The final two issues are really, is there a deal they can reach? And I think they're close. They keep saying they've got some hang-up issues. I saw a report today from, I think, Politico, that Gallego said the major hang-ups left are DeFi related and then potentially on Gallego. So they seem to have solved whatever it is, where the line between SEC and CFC will fall. And then it's just, again, the unbeatable clock. A deal that is reached after Memorial Day is basically useless this Congress, because you never do major legislation right before an election. People are distracted. They're nervous. They also all were like, well, I know we got a deal now, but maybe my side could get a better deal after I invariably win the election and come in with a stonking bigger majority. So that's one of those reasons you never see things after Memorial Day. The biggest X factor I have, frankly, is not about anything related to crypto or the markets or the world. It is just government funding. I have never seen in American history, I've gone back and looked, major either passage of a marquee bill or a significant step of a marquee bill that happens in a shutdown. It just doesn't happen. People get nervous about doing things that are not related to funding when government funding has lapsed. They're worried of attacks. In 95-96 was the last time we had multiple shutdowns of note. They did the Telecom Act in periods between and then after the shutdown. So my nightmare, I think the real fear that no one's talking about, is you make progress in the Senate. You have a markup in January. It's set for a vote in the Senate floor in February. The government funding runs out and it's shut down for 6 months and we miss it because of that. And that would be rather like a guy walking through a fire and an earthquake and tripping on a banana peel and breaking his neck. But it might happen. And it's totally outside of anyone's frank control.
That just sounds like an excellent description of our government right now.
I very much agree with everything that Justin said, and I think he's got it all right. I'm just going to add 2 points. Point number one is I think there were a lot of comments when the Senate Banking Committee set out its request for comments about the first draft of the RFIA. I think that there were a lot of comments that came in, and the Senate is working their way through some of those comments and trying to figure out what to take and what not to take, and that's both the Democrats and the Republicans. And part of what is, I guess I have 3 total comments. Part of what is slowing things down in the Senate is in the House, we had both the House Financial Services and the House Agriculture Committees working together on the same draft legislation, each on their own parts. In the Senate, we don't have that happening. So it's they're, I think, talking to each other, but by and large, deferring to each other on different points rather than trying to work together to solve some of the areas where there's overlap, or at least it's close enough that there's enough to talk about between the two. The last point I would make is that I was actually pretty hopeful. My 50-50 was much more like 70-30 in favor of passage in August and the first half of September. But to Justin's point, as soon as the government shutdown hit, I became much more pessimistic about the chances of success. I've gotten a little bit more optimistic as I've seen the collaborative work that's happening in the Senate since the shutdown ended. And actually, a lot of work was continuing in the Senate while the shutdown was going on. But to Justin's point, and I agree with him 100% on this, is that if we have another government shutdown at the end of January because they can't get the government funding to work, then my 50-50 goes way down, almost regardless of whether it's a 1 week, 1 month, or 6 week or whatever it is shut down. I think it's just going to make it very hard for everybody to want to work together to do something.
And I think this is something that those in crypto often can forget. Crypto now is a big boat for policy. It's the biggest ship in the ocean of the 119th Congress. But the size of the ocean is much bigger than that of the boat. You can do everything right and something can go wrong because of things totally outside of your control in a macro political sense. And if we don't get legislation, I think it's going to be really important for people to consider why that is and realize it could be that we did everything right as an industry and that a lot of the Congress did everything right, and it lost due to deeper ideological fighting and fractiousness, which nobody in this industry or maybe anyone on the planet can control.
Okay, so
I'm sorry, Dave, just one other quick point here. I think this race in Tennessee is going to be really interesting, right? If Afton wins, if the Democrat wins.
That was last night.
Oh, geez. What was the result?
The Democrat did not win.
It
was very close. It was surprisingly close.
The Democrat overperformed by 13 points in very high turnout. So I was tweeting about this last night. It's something for everyone to kind of look to, is that Republicans kept the seat, which is good. The Dems overperformed, which they like. The turnout was high, which frankly is, because the Republicans successfully, made it a more national race. But that means also it's probably a good model for the first time of what a midterm-like election looks like.
Yeah.
And a world where the Dems swing 13 points is one where the House is gone by like 8:30 at night, and the Dems pick up 25, 30 seats in the House. And the Senate is close, which a lot of people thought was not possible. So I do think you're going to see a lot of Dems potentially saying now, maybe we should delay it.
And especially if there's another shutdown, I think that just increases the chances of waiting.
Here's a way in which a lot of people in financial markets and members of Congress are all too similar. Is at some point it's easy to say, well, I'd rather make a decision now. What if I just wait a few more months, things get better? Like, the lesson of crypto policy making is that time and waiting has been the worst choice by everybody on every part of the spectrum. It's like, the longer we wait, the more complicated the questions get, the more impressive and bigger the technology gets, but the harder the issues to delve through. We haven't even discussed the way in which people are started to talk about how prediction markets are going to involve crypto, or the involvement of Plutarchy and using markets for governance. Like, all these things are like the second and third order questions we haven't even touched. We're still on 101 regulation, and the longer we take to get that done, the harder those get.
So let me say and ask you one last question then, because in my extreme cynicism, I'm going to come down on the side that Congress will not do anything, as a much higher probability than maybe what you guys are putting it at. And so, I mean, what do you think things look like for the next 2 years if there is no congressional action?
My sense is that the first step will be, you will start to see efforts by CFC and SEC in particular to do targeted rulemaking and probably no action relief initially, in terms of where they think they have jurisdiction versus where they either think it's a gray area or trying to focus development. I think you'll see a lot more focus on Genius potentially in that rulemaking process, doing as much of the work as you possibly can. So it'll be kind of effort to shoehorn aspects of market structure into Genius regulations, which is a very bad fit. OCC is a great regulator. It is not a markets regulator in the same sense. And then on top of that, I do think you will also start to see proposals to have legislation drafted for next Congress pretty quickly. I mean, the one thing everybody should at least be able to accept is that while the Congress may change, we will not see an end to the filibuster before the next presidential term at this point. The presidency is not changing for 2 more years. So I think you would start to see basically a return to, okay, what other legislative route can we take next Congress. And there's probably also an effort to do a skinny version of market structure as part of a must-pass bill at the end of 2026. I'm skeptical it'll work, but that's usually what people do, is the escape hatch, last, train out of town move when you can't pass a full bill.
Mm-hmm.
I think Justin is spot on everything that he said. And, one of the reasons that we're focusing more of our efforts on the SEC and the CFTC right now than on Congress is precisely that. We want to give the SEC and the CFTC ideas about what they can do now that that will result in as good a market structure as we can get without congressional action, which, by the way, I think we can get pretty good market structure without congressional action. And so I would encourage people who are thinking about this stuff to do the same thing now. One of the things that we in blockchain and crypto have not been so good about is coming together on proposals and getting proposals out there, either for regulation or legislation that are, starting a conversation and that might actually lead to good legislation and regulation. So I think it's super important right now for us to be trying to think about that. That's why we're working closely with the trade associations and others to really try to put forward some ideas that we think are doable without congressional action. So that's where we are.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really kind of good point. On an uplifting note, when government or Congress falters, that's an opportunity for the industry and ordinary users to step up. Like, it is not the case that we in the industry can do nothing in the absence of congressional action. You can start to have anyone propose best practices. You can have anyone come together on nonprofits or on industry stakeholder alliances or on draft legislation. Dave, one of the things I want to really praise the Crypto Task Force for is bringing a lot of voices that are not just from the vantage point of the industry. You got to be at the roundtable. I think that was a good signal of asking for everybody to be involved.
They'll even bring me on, right?
Yeah, right. They know it's a good sign.
For sure, yeah.
I would have asked.
It was a very diverse group.
I was happy they did it without having to ask me. Yeah. If we don't get legislation, that is an opportunity for the industry to find a way forward and to propose best practices in the vacuum. So don't give up, even if something goes wrong. Like, obviously, legislation is always superior, but it's not an all or nothing. There are always second and third best moves to make, including from any individual user.
All right.
Yeah,
well, look,
I very strongly agree with that, Justin. And as I said, I strongly urge people to start to come together and get some proposals out there. You can like my proposal, you can hate my proposal, just have a proposal and let's start the conversation, because we don't want to be in a position where suddenly everybody's looking at each other going, hey, what do we do now? Let's start planning for what we're going to do.
Say what you will about Lee's proposal. At least it's an ethos, okay? But again, thank you so much for joining us. Very much appreciate both of your perspectives. I found this conversation fascinating. I hope everyone else listening in did as well. And we'll look forward to checking back in with you during next quarter's government shutdown and trying to figure out the way forward.
Don't be so optimistic.
I know. I used to be an optimist.
I look, I would happily spend some time in a shutdown, at least chatting with you two about different forms of pie and just watching my office or seeing what people think the shutdown will be on a prediction market.
Perfect. That sounds great.
I think if we're talking during a shutdown, I will have a glass of whiskey with me.
There you go. That's let's talk markets with whiskey and bourbon next year. All right. Thanks, guys. And thanks, everyone, for listening. And hopefully we'll see you again next week on Let's Talk.